The last two seamless sessions, in the first part of which I'm delighted to welcome Matt Rogers from the United States to give a keynote presentation, and then that session will fold into a panel session reviewing the whole day's conversation. Let me say that because this forum has been organised around the idea of a developing coherence of interest among Asian principles in the climate change debate, and we're focused in our conversations over the last day and the last 2 days, in fact, because we had a small round table before today's public forum on those issues. But the United States is, when you move into the international regime in particular, but independently of that, is obviously the elephant in the room, and for good and reasons more problematic. And we're particularly pleased to have Matt Rogers here to bring us an update on developments in the United States and where things are coming from there. With the election of the Obama administration, there was a sense, I suppose, in this area that the US would be a big game changer. As Ross and others have pointed out in earlier sessions today, that was a prediction that was based on an imperfect assessment of the underlying circumstances facing the US and the rest of us in this issue area. Many things have changed in the period since the Obama administration came to power in the United States, and they've changed internationally, as also has been explained in presentations from China and from Ross's scene-setting overview earlier on this afternoon. And the United States has played into those changes actively and positively, but with a gained degree of difficulty, 9.99, as it came through Copenhagen. And domestic political circumstances in the United States have evolved over that period too. Matt brings to us a particular background and experience that is uniquely informed to tell us about what's been going on in the United States. He's, until just a few weeks ago, been senior advisor to Secretary Chu, the Secretary of the Energy Department in the United States, on these and related issues, coming from the economic side. And he's now coming to us in transition, in decompression mode, I hope, with a sort of independent voice to review what's been going on in the United States. So Matt will present for 20, 30 minutes or so, then we'll have some time for questions directed to him, and then we'll move into panel discussion.
Thank you, Peter, for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here in transition. I hadn't put a tie on for a while, so it was good to put a tie on, and I was inclined as we went out to tea break that perhaps we should just move the entire section out to the patio there, where the breeze was blowing and the sun was out, and so hopefully we'll have a good dialogue and then can move in that direction. Thanks too to Frank and Stephen for putting this great dialogue together. One of the things that I had the opportunity to do as a member of the administration was to go to a series of these discussion across the United States, and having these kinds of dialogues that bring together academic perspectives and business perspectives, bring perspectives across many different geographies, are very, very important for bringing a focus and bringing a coherence to the conversation that we are in the middle of right now. I thank Ross for his very important insights, this ability to bring all these pieces together in a coherent and thoughtful and rigorous way. Is something that frankly is all too often missing, and I think those kinds of analyses go a long way, because this is a problem of many pieces that actually are fitting together, and unless you look at them in a coherent and comprehensive way, sometimes you miss the interactions among the various pieces. So I'll go into a discussion, but I thought what I'd start with a little bit of a story. So when we started back last January, I was the third person in the building with Secretary Chu. So we had the Secretary, his Chief of Staff, and me. And that has to do with some other domestic politics, which is it takes, if you have to be confirmed by the legislature, it takes a long time, and that didn't really happen until June. And so a few of us were sitting there, and we got to observe the Secretary, this new Secretary of Energy, be briefed in his new role by all of the programs within the Department of Energy. And as you go into these conversations in Washington, as I'm sure it is here in Canberra and in capitals around the world, there's a standard structure to the briefing for the senior official. And it basically goes like this: Mr. Secretary, it's very good to meet you. This is usually the first time that the program meets the Secretary. Mr. Secretary, there's a very important policy choice in front of us, and there are always three choices. And the three choices basically are something that is just incredibly very difficult, something that if you do it, you'll be called a wimp or worse, and then what the program manager wants you to do. Right? Those are the choices. And so, as the Secretary came into this, and Chu, for his many characteristics, is not a politician, but is a very good scientist. He would routinely stop the conversation. I got to watch going on 20 of these, and it usually happened about the 3-minute mark in an hour briefing. He'd say, stop. Tell me about your science. And there was this long pause. I have to admit that I had that long pause with the Secretary on multiple occasions. I was not a scientist by academic background. And when he would start a conversation, as he did with most of them, tell me about your science, I'm a political science and economics guy. But these conversations would always stop there, and there were three different paths out. The best one was the program manager explained their science. The second one was the program manager picked up the telephone and very quickly called someone who could explain the science to the Secretary. And the bad outcome was trying to fake it. Because if you tried to fake it with Secretary Chu, that ended about the 7-minute mark of the conversation. And then he went back and did research, and we did the meeting again 2 days later, and it was a very painful thing. I go into that story to illustrate the point that by going back to the fundamentals of what the science does, changed the discussion about what the policy options were. So after we got into what the science was, there was a much broader range of policy options actually available than what the program manager had presented at first. And we kind of all knew that, but the Secretary's approach to doing that was to go through the science. And my ardent hope after spending the last 2 years in Washington is that the work that we've actually been doing in the United States will in fact have the characteristic of being the game changer that Peter was talking about, although perhaps not in the way that we all expected going into this administration. And we should talk about what that looks like. So 3 basic points I'd like to make as we go through here, and then we can obviously have a much broader conversation. The first driver of what we've been doing is that innovation drives productivity, which drives economic growth, and that energy innovation is one of the most important innovation cycles that we have in economies around the world. There's actually an interesting paper from somebody here on that, out on the table outside. But this nexus between innovation and productivity and economic growth, if we forget that and we begin to think that, for example, financial engineering is innovation, we end up getting very, very lost. So one of the key goals is how do we reestablish that linkage between innovation, productivity, and economic growth. The second key observation then is within the conversation, the rate of change in energy technologies, in clean energy technologies, is much faster and much deeper than the market currently expects. And if you believe what I've come to believe over the last 2 years, it changes the policy options that we have in front of us. If in fact we can take battery technology from $1,000 a kilowatt hour today, and you asked me 2 years ago where it would go, I would have said it had an asymptote at about $500 a kilowatt hour. That's as low as it could possibly go. I walk out of the administration today thinking that the asymptote is probably at $50 a kilowatt hour, not 500, And that makes all the difference in terms of the mobility solutions that we have in the United States and around the world. It also makes all the difference in terms of how you think about renewables integrating into the grid. So the rate of change of technology matters deeply to the policy choices that we have in front of us. And then finally, and from an important U.S. domestic political perspective, what the Recovery Act tried to do, what I tried to do in the work that I've been working on for the last 2 years, which was to spend roughly $35 billion in a thoughtful and disciplined way on $100 billion of clean energy projects that now we're spending out at a rate of $1 billion every month. In trying to do that, what it did was it made real, for the American people at least, what a clean energy economy meant. When we started this administration and we talked about a clean energy economy, it was a conceptual, theoretical, and frankly frightening idea for most of the American public. And as we leave this period of time, what I hope we've been able to do is to make very clear and tangible what a clean energy economy means for consumers and manufacturers and employees across the United States in our very different regions. Because by making it specific and tangible, all of a sudden it isn't very frightening. We're not actually trying to go into a forest without a flashlight. We actually can see a pathway that's clear and there's street lights built and you can actually see where you're going. And by doing that, I think it actually begins to change the political equation. So why don't we go into, and I'll show you a couple pictures to keep everybody alive and awake as we get into this, and then let's do a couple of questions. So I started this work, I got a call from the Secretary of Energy literally on Christmas Eve of 2008 going into 2009. I was up in the mountains outside of San Francisco and was not looking for a job in the administration, but as the Secretary, who is a very persistent person, continued to point out, the stock market's collapsing, we're losing 750,000 jobs every month, our financial system is in crisis, and I've spent the last 20 years in the private sector, and I might actually be able to help a little bit. And so that was sort of what drove me to join, but it also was the key motivator behind the structure of the Recovery Act and the energy spending in the United States. So it's very important to think about the economic backdrop with respect to what we were doing in energy. So as we thought about what I tried to bring in to the department, and I think it becomes important broadly about how government engages in this discussion, was to bring to the Department of Energy a sense of operational discipline, which we began to talk about as accountability every day. You barely see in the background, the U.S. Department of Energy was built, the building was built in 1968 to be the U.S. Army headquarters after Vietnam. It's a bunker. It is designed to be a silo. We also do the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal. We know how to build silos really deep. We know how to build bunkers. We know how not to deal with people. And yet we had to actually begin to change that process. So we had to do things like make higher quality decisions and do them faster, because we didn't have time as our friend. We had to break down the silos within the Department of Energy, and we had to work between the Department of Energy, the other areas of government, and the private markets better than we had in the past. We had to do a lot to increase transparency and accountability. One of the things that we did under the Recovery Act is you could see our performance every day on the web. For a guy who spent 20 years in a private company, the notion of putting out my performance every day up on the World Wide Web was just a little bit uncomfortable. And yet, what I came to realize was that in these kinds of debate, that kind of transparency is enormously important for building the trust of the public in the policies that are being pursued. So if we think about things that came out of Copenhagen that matter, let's put together some of the benchmarking across countries of real data. We took in the Recovery Act, we put every state in the United States, their performance up every month. We didn't put a red light or a green light or a yellow light against it, we just put it up. And we told the press that we put it up. And the fact that it was up every month, I could then call each governor in the United States and say, your state's in the bottom decile. And then all of a sudden great things would happen and they would jump out of the bottom decile. And there was no statutory requirement, there was no regulatory requirement, there was no official reason that they didn't have to be in the bottom decile, but I did have to publish, and I published it, and then things changed. So there really is something about accountability and transparency. We had to meet our targets on time, on budget, and do it safely, because this is a process where if you run the train off the tracks, you actually have to stop everything as opposed to move forward at speed. And we had to select great projects. One of the things that we did as part of this was we had 30,000 applications come in to the department for the fundings that we had. It was a very cold day in February of 2009 where we realized that we had roughly 800 reviewers to handle 30,000 projects. And you do a little simple math about reviews per project and things like that, and we would still be doing reviews now. So the Secretary sent out a note to every major college and university in the United States and said, we need some of your best people to come in and help us review. And we ended up with about 4,500 reviewers who helped us get through the summer of 2009, going through all 30,000 of those projects to end up with 5,000 really great projects. And the core of it, and what we were trying to do, is to make a meaningful down payment on the nation's energy and environmental future. Recognizing that this is not solving the problem, but it is making a down payment, a sense of momentum that if we build on, we can actually get somewhere. We did this with a set of portfolio principles that the Secretary, that is in fact a picture of the Secretary, back in his earlier days, that he drew out of his experience early on at Bell Labs, which was one of the real centers of great flowering of innovation in U.S. history. And there were 4 basic principles that we tried to follow. One was to create a competition among technologies. So in transportation, for example, we're creating a competition among biofuels and transportation electrification and natural gas and the internal combustion engine and fuel cells. And each of them, because there is a competition, each of them is performing better. It raises the bar. We're also investing in innovation across the entire innovation spectrum, all the way from very basic research all the way into deployment in the marketplace. One of the risks that I think the United States runs is to just focus on the early end of the innovation pipeline without recognizing that the innovation stream is actually something that keeps building on each other all the way from the lab into the pilot stage, from the pilot into the first commercialization, and out into market deployment. We had to invest across the whole supply chain. We invested, including manufacturing, all the way back to some of the component manufacturers, because in the case of batteries, again, to use that example, you can't have a battery factory and then not have some of the cell dividers and not have anode and cathode suppliers. So you actually have to build up an entire supply chain at the same time. And we tried to focus the funding that we had, a lot of money, but relative to the opportunity and relative to the need, not nearly enough, on those areas in the development of technologies where the government has a uniquely important role to play, and frankly to stay out of the others, because the government can actually get in the way if it plays too much in deployment of existing commercial technologies, but it has a very important role to play, for example, in the innovation space. If you look back at the last 2 decades of Nobel Prizes for science and medicine, 60% of those were funded by the U.S. government, and 75% of them were funded by governments around the world. Only less than 25% of them were actually funded by what we would call private sources, either philanthropic or corporate, which goes to one of the real challenges of innovation that becomes important for this. But underlying all of this was this notion that by creating a competition among technologies, both across an area and then, by the way, within batteries, 6 or 8 different pathways to success, we both raise the bar on performance, which increases then significantly the probability of success. If there's 6 different ways to get to a good outcome, where each outcome raises the bar by 50%, the probability that the bar goes up by 50% is pretty high, even though you don't know which one of those technologies is actually going to get there. So what we ended up with was an exceptionally exciting portfolio of technologies, a range of technology innovation that I would never have imagined before we started, and a range of technology innovation that gives me a great deal of hope that we can achieve our energy and environmental goals both faster and dramatically cheaper than I think the market expects today. You take a look at it in renewable energy. We were both involved in deploying existing renewable energy technologies in the United States. 2009 was the best year in the United States for wind, 10 gigawatts of wind, solar, and geothermal in its history. This is a set of technologies where in February, most of them were shutting down, and because of the Recovery Act, because of a set in particular of tax incentives for the Recovery Act, we were able to make sure that that industry not only moved forward at pace, but actually grew substantially. We saw significant foreign direct investment in the United States for manufacturing of renewables, which we hadn't seen before, and so all of a sudden we have a vibrant renewables industry in the United States, which we'd lost track of across the last 15 years or so. And at the same time, we're investing in a set of innovative new technologies that promise to change the way that we think about renewable energy. What the Secretary keeps on his desk a flow design wind turbine example, which is essentially a way to make a wind turbine that's roughly this big, using high performance aerospace materials that allow it to work in urban settings, in very low wind kinds of settings, because you can actually get a lot more torque in a very small area with some advanced materials. If we're already in many places in the United States at grid parity in wind, this would take us to grid superiority in wind. Same thing on the solar side, with a set of new solar technologies that really offer the opportunity to take us from where we are today, let's call it $4 a kilowatt, down to $1.50, or if Kathy Zoe, the Assistant Secretary, who actually spent the last 15 years here in Australia, gets her way down to $1 a watt. That's really the challenge. Real great innovations in renewable energy. Tremendous innovations in carbon capture and sequestration. One of the hardest decisions that this administration made was a decision to move forward with what we called Future Gen 2.0, which was around bringing oxy-combustion technology as a retrofit technology for U.S. coal-fired power plants. This is a technology that essentially, if it delivers as promised, would enable you to go in and retrofit an existing coal-fired power plant at near zero emissions at the cost roughly of building a new natural gas-fired power plant, which in the U.S. context, where we have 600 coal-fired generating stations, where half of the CO2 in the United States is generated in that context, and where we're going to close down 35% of them if the EPA rules just on existing hazardous pollutants, sulfur, nitrogen, mercury, particulates. Just those rules will close down 35% of the coal-fired power plants in the United States. But with this new technological innovation, the opportunity is there actually to retrofit those plants and have those be lower emissions than a natural gas-fired power plant. And yet at the same time, we're funding a set of research that uses carbonic anhydride, the same enzyme that operates in your lungs, to extract CO2 from flue gas streams at incredibly low cost. So trying to bring biotechnology to carbon capture using a set of very innovative biotechnology companies to make that happen. Whole set of things on energy efficiency. We spent $11 billion in the United States really raising the energy efficiency of what is a relatively low energy productivity economy, and drove a set of innovations around how we get high performance air conditioning, for example, to a whole different level through innovation. In the transportation sector, we spent $2.4 billion building a batteries and transportation electrification industry in the United States, and invested in a set of innovative new technologies, both in terms of grid scale storage and in terms of transportation batteries that enable us to dramatically drop the cost. Again, simple math, if we get down below $250 a kilowatt hour, every car will want to have some form of electrification on board. Why? Because it's cheap. And when it's cheap, all of a sudden the market demand signals are really, really clear. Every producer wants to have one, because every consumer wants to have one. And one of the fascinating things was to watch as the manufacturers were looking at their next generation product cycles for 2012, how fast the costs were coming down as the manufacturing capacity came online in the United States. There really is a relationship between having manufacturing capacity and what happens to the price. We saw it in solar, we've seen it in batteries. The prices are coming down, and therefore great things begin to happen in the marketplace. a whole set of things around science and innovation, some funding within the Recovery Act for basic research, for putting in place new light sources at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, Stanford University. These kind of light sources enable us to go in and look at the molecular level at how atoms begin to perform. Some of the work that's being done at the Argonne National Laboratory today looks at how anodes and cathodes operate at the molecular level. And what you realize is, I mean, the way we make anodes and cathodes today, I don't know how many of you, the way your children make those little crystal sets that come out of sugar crystals and things, it's about that sophisticated. And if you put just a little bit of science in, we might actually get a dramatic improvement in performance, but it requires user facilities at the hundreds of millions of dollar level that no individual company would ever fund. And then in the smart grid, we spent $4.5 billion putting smart grid into 49 out of the 50 U.S. states. Why did we do that? Part of it is a U.S. political reality. Every state is its own regulator. If each state says, well, I'll go after you, sir, no, after you, sir, and in that context, we don't actually go forward very fast. And so by having an experiment, if you will, in every one of the states, then every state has an example. 10% of their citizens have their smart grids. They see how the costs come down as a result of that. And then all of a sudden it becomes much easier for the private sector to take the next piece. And we're doing a set of very innovative research in how to take essentially a set of technologies at the substation and transformer level that Thomas Edison would recognize if he came back from the grave today, and translate them at least into the 20th century, if not into the 21st century, by digitizing it, by essentially putting a substation on a chip, which is in fact possible to do today. So where does that take us? What it has given us in the United States, at least, is the beginning of a roadmap that is clear, that begins to say you can actually get from where we are today to where we want to go from an energy and climate debate. And it's not all that frightening. There is actually a viewable path. There are actually several viewable paths. And now we can begin to make choices as opposed to having a theoretical conversation. And we can begin to move at highway speeds towards the future because we can have some confidence that in my neighborhood, it means that there's a manufacturing facility that supplies a wind turbine company. And in North Carolina, there's one that supplies light-emitting diodes for the lighting industry. And this is something that the whole U.S. can actually participate in. But our future success actually does depend, if we don't get ahead of ourselves, on aligning our leadership framework. We actually have to make sure that the innovation pipeline that we have is aligned with the policy directions that are set in Washington, are aligned with the financial markets and the ability to fund this kind of innovation. And the thing that I actually found most missing in the discussions that we have, the managerial discipline to pull all this off. Because bringing this kind of new technology into a market is actually very, very hard. And we're actually not doing it so well today. So if we work through that, I said before, the innovation pipeline is very deep and very healthy, and it doesn't matter whether it's solar, wind, or geothermal. There's the advanced biofuels are working very well. We talked about smart grid. Things like unconventional gas, which I think you folks are experiencing here in Australia as well. We see in China, we see in India. Unconventional gas technology innovation is changing the game in terms of gas accessibility on a global basis, with very important political dynamics. And then the one I didn't have on here is just the whole discussion about nuclear and the innovations that are going on in nuclear. The rate of change in each of these technologies is very, very rapid, much more rapid, and when we should have much greater confidence than the market currently does. The policy choices, too, I think, are relatively clear. What do you need to do and we've heard a number of very much more detailed and thoughtful ones than this, but from a U.S. standpoint, it's relatively clear that we have to increase R&D, that is a unique role that the United States should be playing a leadership role in, has and can do in the future, but we need to continue that. We have to ensure that there's a strong domestic market, or else you don't get the pull of technologies into the market. We have to rebuild manufacturing because these are very new industries, and the level of integration actually makes a big difference from innovation to manufacturing. You can't, in these, do innovation without doing manufacturing. We have to streamline siting and permitting because we make it really, really hard in the U.S. at least to do anything because we just decide that, well, not in my backyard, even if it's a really nice clean energy technology. We do have to put a price on CO2. And then there are a few things like efficiency where we actually just have to use standards because just putting a price on it actually doesn't get to where we need to go. The clear rules then bring private capital off the sidelines. The U.S. needs something on the order of $30 to $40 billion each year of private capital coming into clean energy technologies to achieve our goals. And in order to do that, you actually have to have a stable tax regime, you have to have technical standards, a set of abilities to certify technologies. You need a workforce that actually can deliver against these challenges. One of the challenges I think we as a developed world face is a very important societal shift to a set of jobs that actually require a very high degree of technical skill, even to do the baseline manufacturing and quality control jobs. And we need consistent intellectual property protection. The managerial challenge that we face is a system integration challenge. If you are the CEO of a utility in the United States, but a utility, frankly, anywhere in the world, you are not sleeping well at night. Because what you have is a world where I should be seeing, let's call it 30 to 40% renewables coming in, and about 20% of the transportation fleet is coming in on an electrified basis. I'm moving from once a month testing, figuring out what my customer's usage is, to finding out my customer's usage every 6 seconds, or 6 minutes. I'm having the ability now to go in and control on the order of a half a dozen different appliances in every customer's home to manage my demand. And ladies and gentlemen, I tell you, I don't have the capability to do that as a utility today. I don't have the IT capability. I don't have the engineering capability. I don't know how to put all these pieces together. And that is the opportunity, but it's also the great challenge. We had one of the US CEOs, he said, just to do the smart grid takes between 30 and 50 technologies that all of a sudden my engineers have to buy and plug together. And when you do it at the 30 or 50 technology level, you get something that's really extraordinary. But if I do it at the 1 or 2 technology level, it kind of is blah, and it takes as much work to implement it at the customer site to do it with 1 technology as it does to do it with 50 technologies. So I got to figure out how to do the 50, but this is a problem that very few companies actually have the ability to handle. The good news is that we're beginning to see a set of clean energy technology networks come together. Cisco is an example. This one talks about Itron. Cisco's somewhere up there. Cisco did this in telecom. Cisco said basically, you as a company don't want to do your own IT. We're going to bring all the technologies together into a router package, and you can just buy the Cisco package, and that's going to work together really well. They're beginning to do this in clean energy technologies, and we're seeing this across a broad range of the technology landscape, is the ability to bring those pieces back together again. So what are the lessons that I've learned over the last 21 months working in Washington? There are others that can be shared over a beer, but for the purposes of this audience, there really are. We are in the middle of a dramatic change in clean energy technologies. We have significant momentum in the innovation marketplace. The pipeline is very deep. It is very rich. And as a developed world, we need to figure out how to double down on the rate of change there, because that drives productivity, which drives economic growth, which makes all of this much easier to handle. These clean energy technologies improve resource productivity and competitiveness, and if you believe the learning curves and the scale curves that I'm coming to believe coming out of this, they save consumers a lot of money. And that was a part that I wouldn't have guessed early on. Integration really does matter. We do have to be able to go all the way from innovation to manufacturing, out to deployment and into the aftermarket services, because these technologies are changing too fast. And if you don't have that linkage established, you're going to miss a product cycle or 2. And we actually need a disciplined 3 or 4 product cycles to get where we need to go. Managerial discipline is winning, and the lack of managerial discipline is creating real messes. So both sides of that equation are true. Governments have a very important role to play, but it is a limited one, and we have to make sure that the government stay focused on the roles where they are uniquely positioned. And today, jobs and productivity are the currency. certainly within the United States, across the various regions of the United States. That's how people decide whether they want to move forward with any of these ideas, is whether it helps them on jobs, whether it helps them on economic productivity and competitiveness. That's the currency of debate, at least within the U.S. Today. With that, I thank you very much, and I'm more than happy to take your questions.
Well, let's take one or two questions before we move into panel session. Yes, up the back here. Two up the back.
Is there any calculation of how much emission reduction this pipeline will bring to the U.S. emissions and by when?
So the official version of that will come out when the EIA does their annual energy outlook, the Energy Information Administration in the U.S. in the springtime. I think what the underlying thesis that I would share is that what the technology enables you to do in the first instance is to grow without growing CO2 because the consumers just want it. The challenge that the U.S. faces is a capital stock turnover problem, in the sense that we have a very large embedded high pollution base that doesn't want to turn over very rapidly unless there's an incentive. So unless you put a price on carbon, you actually don't see CO2 come down very far. But if you do put a price on carbon with these kind of technologies, it actually is much cheaper than any of the estimates were for Waxman-Markey or any of the other legislative aims.
Let's accumulate two or three and then you can take them all at once. Yep.
I'm interested in how the US taxpayer will recover some benefit from its investment.
I actually have a couple of questions. Have you given this talk to US climate negotiators? Because I actually see a bit of a disconnect between, I actually study energy innovation, I'm a believer in innovation, but I actually see a disconnect between, I think, the kind of, the positive potential of leveraging innovation and, in a sense, the US's perspective in terms of unwillingness to take on strong commitments. Second question, actually, I think, you talked about the stimulus spending. But in some sense, U.S. Congress has been very reluctant to increase the DOE R&D budgets. I remember I worked in a study back in 1997 for PCAST, where the recommendations were to double R&D budgets. Nothing happened. There have been many calls. So in a sense, I think, are you also, in a sense, able to make a case to the Congress? Do you think that, in a sense, beyond the stimulus spending, there is going to be the bulge or the rise in R&D expenditure that is required to maintain this pipeline that you're talking about?
Take those two questions and we've got one from Roscoe.
So maybe we'll link those together. I think what we can now begin to do is to look at the rate of return on investment in innovation in a different way. It was a tremendous privilege to have this kind of funding. We essentially had almost a tenfold increase in funding for energy technologies within DOE just in this one block of funds, which enabled us to do a lot of different pieces. And by doing it across the whole innovation spectrum, to begin to show folks exactly the kind of magnitude of impact that you can have. And the key to it, how does the taxpayer win? The taxpayer wins by greater economic growth and productivity. And you can begin to show, if simple one, the difference between $300 a kilowatt hours on batteries and $100 a kilowatt hours in batteries, if you like doing linear programming in a global economic standpoint, is enormous. Right? So as an economy, I'm willing to invest a lot to make that change occur, because the taxpayer wins hands down when the economy grows in that kind of context. So I think we're beginning to be able to make that happen. There's a good coalition together that's now making that case to Congress that is, I think, bipartisan. It's across the aisles, and so I'm more encouraged. But we are also going into a very, very difficult fiscal environment, and so I'm not Pollyannish at all about that. And then, we spent a good deal of time with David Sanlow, who's the Assistant Secretary for Policy International, spent a lot of time with David Stern as we went into the negotiations. I'm not sure that it was a lack of information, although we can be siloed too, as it was a set of domestic political challenges that David and others faced in those negotiations.
Ross?
Yes, Matt, thank you very much. Very stimulating. At the pure research end, developing new technologies, in Australia, we win more than our share of Nobel Prizes in the biological sciences, pretty good at that end. Some of that work, some of those skills are being applied to innovations relevant to energy transformation. It's my impression that it's pretty isolated, bits and pieces, and similarly on the whole CCS range of research, we've got some pretty interesting stuff going. My question is, are we linked enough internationally in the pure research, and what should we be doing about making sure that clever Australians working on very particular projects are not reinventing the wheel and are collaborating effectively with the best work in the US?
Yeah. So, global collaboration is something that's very, very important to the Secretary. He wants to make sure that India, China, Australia, US, England, Eastern Europe, for example, and CCS are all working together, and we're only, and every time we talk about it, he's frustrated because we haven't moved nearly far enough on there. So there's a lot more that we can do, particularly at the basic research level. The other observation that's correlated with that is that what we're finding, and again, one of the things the Secretary would drive hard, is that the great innovations are occurring when you get multidisciplinary teams together. So in the electrofuels area and in the CCS area, electrofuels, 60% of the researchers had not done energy research in the last 24 months and are now doing energy research. They're bringing a whole different set of lenses, and when you put a physicist, a chemist, and a biologist together, the chemist had been beating his head against the wall doing amine things, and all of a sudden the biologist came in and said, well, I got an idea, and pretty soon they start playing off each other. And so what we have to do are find ways that on a global basis we're getting that collaboration, and then on an interdisciplinary basis we're driving some of those collaborations. And there are a set of things interesting from a policy standpoint that governments can do to get that interdisciplinary collaboration to work. The money only comes if you get a number of different disciplines together, and boy, that focuses the mind in some amazing, amazing ways.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let me not only thank Matt, but also thank his mate, Ambassador Jeff Blatch, who managed to get him here for this meeting, and, but thank Matt very much for that presentation. Stephen will chair this last panel session, which includes Matt and
Andreas. Well, thanks, Peter, and thank you, Matt. So we really do have an embarrassment of riches here today for you, and appreciate you staying here to the end. I'm sure you're tired after a long day. We will finish on time. But we wanted to have this final session to give some of our guests, unfortunately we just didn't have time for everyone, a chance to put forward final, very brief reflections. If possible, we'll take a few final comments from you all as well. But I want to ask Andreas Löschel to kick off in a slightly different role. Andreas is from the... Andreas is from Europe. Andreas is the head of Department of Environmental Economics for the Centre of European Economic Research, one of the leading think tanks in Europe when it comes to climate change. He's a visitor here at Crawford. I think the European perspective is particularly important for us, even with our focus on Asia. Europe, at least compared to developed countries, is very different. We have tried and failed to introduce a carbon price here. We have a very partisan debate, and it's not just Australia. Look at the US, look at Japan, but somehow Europe has managed to introduce a carbon price and has an extraordinary degree of bipartisan consensus. So, Andreas, if you could just give us 5 to 10 minutes, very quick snapshot of perspective from Europe, we'd really appreciate it.
Coming here, I had the possibility to share a bit the experiences that we had with the EU emission trading system, and I found, of course, that many people are very interested in this system as we are now moving to the third phase of the European emission trading, starting the year 2013. This is, of course, the internal discussion that we had in how we move ahead with the system, how well actually it worked in the first two phases. And I think in Europe, to sum that up, I mean, we've made quite some progress in carbon pricing in the recent years. So if you look in the different phases of the EU emission trading system, from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, we actually improved our system to become better price signals into the different entities, into the different companies to increase their investments in energy efficiency, but it's still a long way to go. No? We have seen that these incentives are or were in the first years very low. I mean, as well due to over-allocation of certificates in the European system, a very lax allocation and grandfathering that happened for the different entities, and low prices that resulted out of that. So therefore, the signals were low, but they increased significantly, and we have actually good hope that in the next phase, starting in 2013, we will see actually a relatively good functioning, economically efficient carbon price signal that is helping Europe to move ahead as well on its carbon targets. Then the international dimension is as well interesting, I think, because of course Europe was kind of marginalized now in the Copenhagen debate, and there the discussion was in Europe, well, should we? I mean, was this really a successful deal, no, to have this 20% target ahead of the international discussions and try to trigger other people's going stronger, because it kind of seemed not very successful. So should we move actually on and now go for 30%? And the European Commission actually assessed then in the mid of this year the Copenhagen Accords and asked this question, should we go to 30% based on what we have on the table? And they decided no, we should not go for 30%. The background was twofold, I think. First, of course, the economic situation in Europe, which made it very difficult to actually bring this message, that we should have now more investments and more money spent on this climate and energy issue. As well, probably a bit this frustrating experience from Copenhagen, where we actually thought probably just wait and see what happens on the international scene. But I think as well in the last month, this picture cleared up a bit. I mean, let's say the assessment of the Commission on moving towards 30% showed that the extra effort that is necessary to get to the 30% target is actually probably smaller than we expected. The reason is that we have a lot of emission reductions already achieved. Europe has now already reduced CO2 emissions relative to 1990 by about 17.5%. Okay, so we are already quite there. And that was, of course, partly due to the drop in emissions in the last year due to the economic crisis. Emissions in Europe dropped by more than 6% in the last year. Just because of that. So we are already quite ahead as well in the reductions, and the European Environmental Agency expects that we are going to meet our 20% reduction target with the measures that are already in place fully domestically, without any international use of flexible mechanisms in the Kyoto Protocol. Any offsets will not be necessary to achieve this target. So therefore, we are already quite some way on these targets, and then it's probably not as expensive. And I would, and then we have, of course, a huge pressure from some countries, like Germany, for example, like the UK, that really want to have this happening. So we had a joint letter of the environmental ministers of Germany, France, and the UK in the Financial Times, in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, actually pushing for now unconditional going to 30%. So they really saw the possibility to push here innovation and be a front runner on these issues. But of course there is not a shared vision in the EU, as you probably know. I mean, there was huge resistance from the Eastern European countries, as we've already seen that in the discussions on the third phase of the EU emission trading from Italy. So that actually resulted in a situation where this meeting of the environmental ministers last week, they postponed again the decision on the 30% target to next year, because they could not resolve these differences. But they as well asked the Commission to make clearer what are actually the effects on a member state level of moving to 30%. Yeah? And that's exactly the way how, in a way, these things are usually dealt with in the European policy making. If you think about the past experience, of course, moving to phase 3 in the emission trading system, it was clear that the full auctioning of certificates for the electricity sector would hurt economies, for example, like Poland and other Eastern European countries, dramatically, because they are so dependent on coal. So what we did is we gave them, a larger fraction of the auctioning revenues in order to compensate for that. And I think we might see as well something like that happening. The Commission is now working out what are really the effects of moving to 30%. On the member state level, to see as well what are the distributional consequences of that. And then they are going to develop a new long-term vision up to 2050. That's the thing what the Commission is currently working on. I was visiting economists with the Commission last month, so that's the big thing in Brussels now, having this long-term view up to 2050. And then they're going to embed the 2020 target, I guess, in these long-term views. And it will depend then, I would say, what happens in the international negotiation on the one hand side and what happens with the economic climate in Europe on the other side. Last week we have published new growth numbers in Germany, plus 3.5%, so that was very positive. Now it will depend whether this actually accelerates a bit, the willingness of taking on these new targets. So I think there will be interesting times ahead, but I'm relatively optimistic now that we have now a good chance that if, as I said, we have some movement on the international level, if these the economies are catching up again, that we are going to resolve these internal problems in Europe and probably as well move to 30% in the next year probably.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andreas. I think it's fascinating perspectives, and one probably most of us simply weren't aware of. I'll now turn to each of the other members of the panel. The question in the program is where to next? The answer to that is obvious, outside for drinks. I just asked you to make no more than 2 minutes closing remarks. What would you like to leave behind as your perspectives on the day, your words of wisdom? And we'll just go down the table and perhaps we'll leave, let's give you Matt, we'll leave you for last, Matt. So could we start with you, Mr. Parent? Sorry, I'm on the spot, and we'll head down the table.
Well, I thought that the lady would have taken me. Okay, good. Well, I would certainly like to join Andreas for some optimism. And currently, I think from the meeting today, I can tell that we have 2 disconnected processes among the countries in the world. One process is with regard to emission reduction. The race is down to the bottom. Everybody does not want to make a commitment to emission reductions. But on the other hand, with regard to decarbonization, everybody is trying to lead the process. So these 2 processes go in parallel, and they are not connected. I think that if we cooperate, if we coordinate, and if we get them connected, I think that the solution is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nishimura.
Thank you. Well, my take is this. I think pricing carbon is not evidently the entirety of the reply. Carbon pricing is indispensable as far as I'm concerned in order to change behavior globally. Because if there is no pricing on carbon you emit, and carbon with that you pollute, you will emit tremendously. So I think in order for the global behavior of citizens and enterprises, I think we need price on carbon. But at the same time, I think we need, as we have heard from Matt, we need a mix of policies, standard policies, energy efficiency, metering, and public investment for R&D. All that sort of things must be pushed forward so that pricing of carbon can work more efficiently. So that is one thing which I really like to say. Another thing which I like to take from our discussions is that that if one country tried to abate by its own, within its own border, it's very expensive. It's going to be very, very expensive. The sign of that expensive nature is that the system is offering price flexible mechanism in the form of CDM. So definitely, if we go alone in abating within our border line, then it's going to be very, very expensive. If we do abate jointly with Indonesia, Japan, with single target, then we can both abate less expensive. So if we do this, then globally, even further, even more, even less expensive. So this is the basic, the basic rationale for us to put price on global carbon instead of put our price on national carbon, like Australian carbon, Japanese carbon, US carbon. I just wonder, I would very much like to ask you, Matt, whether your folks who have resisted to putting a price on American carbon, and that is the fact I think we have to accept as of today. Are they going to accept putting a price on global carbon instead of American carbon? Well, that is, if you like, you can answer.
Thank you. Well, we'll give Matt a chance at the end. Let's move on. Eka, welcome your
Thank you. When I'm coming here, it's really, something different that I used to, because I used to go to negotiation, and the negotiation, nobody really speaking, actually. They are just doing all the texting. But, and so it's good to have these discussions, because what I see, and what happened everywhere, is that there is always, as Dr. Pan says, these connections between what happened in negotiations, because it is a negotiation. You have to negotiate, you have to put the highest call, because otherwise you cannot get what you want. I mean, that's the art of negotiations. But then when you go to discussion like this, then you start seeing there's a lot of actual solutions can be made. through this kind of discussions. But now the question is, and I think this is the questions that all of us should answer, is that how we can use kind of these discussions to also move forward what really happened in the international negotiation. There's a lot of things, a lot of initiatives saying about how to link science to policy, how to link the scientific discussion, scientific knowledge to real policies discussion. But that is not really, this question is still there. It's a question that I cannot answer myself, but I would like us to somehow in the futures really looking on how to actually using the standards. We have a lot of standards actually everywhere, and there's something on that. There is a reluctance, and I'm speaking not in my head as a negotiator, but it seems that there is a reluctance among negotiators to really talking about scientific evidence. So, sometimes then probably the scientific world needs to understand as well that reluctancy and then start, also talking in their language. There is still, we need to find out how to fine-tune, trying to connect those two different languages. And I think I agree with some of the previous speakers saying that we're actually talking about the same things. We are asking about target. And some countries doesn't want to have a target right now because they're waiting for the international negotiation, when it comes and when it goes. But then actually, they are talking about the target in the different kind of different terms. Decarbonizations, low carbon development, it's the same thing. So how can we actually use that as well? And in particular, I think the scientific community to work on that, really helping the government. And the other thing is that I agree completely that all countries have to do something. You cannot leave just one country behind or ask one country to do everything for the work, because it might not work. It needs everybody to work together and so on. And we cannot, everybody has their limitations, we understand that. And if the developed countries, Andreas just told us, the difficulties to move forward because of economic condition, the social condition, but actually that's what happened in developing countries. It's even more difficult for us to move forward because there's a lot of issues that we haven't answered. But then, if we can really working together, out of the context of international negotiations, this is me without the negotiation applicants. Don't always waiting for what happened in international negotiation. We can start something. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's very good words of advice. So we'll skip you, Andreas, if you don't mind, and we'll go to another which.
I think I'll just make a couple of points, actually picking up on some of the other talks. I think, first of all, I want to just pick up on Matt's talk, and I think I actually really like the kind of the systematic perspective on innovation there. Innovation really is, in a sense, if you're thinking about effective innovation, you have to think about inputs, which is putting in R&D. Then you have to think about effectively managing the process, which is the input-output relationship, getting as much bang for the buck. And thirdly, it's actually about getting some impact in terms of getting the technologies out there. So I'm really delighted that Steve Chu is actually thinking about all of those, and so is the Department of Energy, because I think it's very much in the right direction. And obviously, it's something that's obviously, I believe, is important for developing countries too, though, of course, there the innovation programs will look very different because you're not talking as much cutting-edge innovation. But you do need to think about programs that do promote innovation in those countries too. But in the end, I want to pick up on the point that he left us with, which is in the end that you do need, for these technologies to really make an impact, you need a signal. And the signal then, in a sense, takes us to the point that was made by a couple of the other speakers, which is the need to have a multilateral agreement, which is what Professor Nishimura said. And then Ross Garner's point about actually doing a principle-based allocation. I do believe, in a sense, that is what we need in order to give the signal to the different communities, scientific, technological, that want to make a contribution. But if we do not do this process of coming up with a fair and a principled allocation, I think we're not going to get there. I actually see a lot of push right now to say that developing countries should come into some kind of a regime, and then we'll actually work together fairly. I actually want to turn that around. I actually think that if you build a fair regime, there is no question that developing countries will get on board. So in fact, I'd like to put the ball back in the court and say, I think let's focus on building a fair regime, and I can guarantee you that developing countries will participate in that. So I think that is what we need to do in order to then come together, or everybody to work together, and then provide the right kind of signal so we can have this kind of innovation really helping us solve the problem.
Good. Thank you very much. Matt, would you like to have almost the final word?
Sure. See, is that working? So I guess two basic thoughts to leave with. I do think this nexus of competition driving innovation, innovation driving productivity, productivity driving wealth is essential, because if that part of the equation is alive and healthy, then all the rest of it becomes doable. If that part is dead or moribund, I think we have a really hard time achieving any of the goals that we talk about. I do worry, as Nishimura-san highlights here, about this autarky issue. We are seeing within the United States a tendency for states to want to say, well, I'm only going to do renewables within my state borders, and I don't want to trade across state borders. You take that then at the national level, and we see the same thing. At one level, it's natural. We're in the middle of an economic transition, and so people want to protect their infant industries, and we see this on a global basis as well. But it is very, very clear that autarky is a lot more expensive than a trading regime. We are having a vote in California on Tuesday as to whether or not to continue with a set of California-specific initiatives. Now, the paradox of that is that a California-only model is unbelievably expensive versus a U.S. model versus a global model. And yet, I for one will be voting in favor of the California model, because by starting at the state level, we in fact now will have something on the order of 24 states in the United States with various forms of markets underway. And it's really inefficient and kind of clunky, and yet it begins to move us in the right direction, and begins to build momentum, and it begins to create a constituency for a more efficient outcome. And so what I wonder, and this is a question, I wonder whether we on a global basis actually have to struggle through some relatively clunky and inefficient things before we get to the really efficient thing, even though we'd all know that we'd really like to start with the efficient thing. I don't know, but that's sort of where it feels like we're headed at the moment.
Well, thank you, Matt. I think we have heard a lot of common themes come out of the whole day, and this discussion, and not to underestimate the divides, but from my takeaway, it's a very messy world. It's a much more difficult world than we thought, not necessarily more expensive, but it's just much more difficult to get that international regime in place. It's much more difficult at the national level to get carbon pricing in place. No one knows that better than us. But it's not a stagnant world. It's not a world where nothing's happening. In fact, it's a world of very rapid change. And I think that's it's encouraging. It underlines the need for a forum such as this, and it also suggests, because it is messy, difficult, we need to move forward. We don't want to take a sequential approach. In a sense, we need to move forward on all fronts. Well, this is the never-ending forum, or an infinite loop, and we're going to close today's session and then start something else. Before I invite Dr. Martin Parkinson to come up to the podium, let me just close this forum. I'll do that for you, Martin, and you can open the centre. Let me close because I want to thank a few people. First, I want to thank Peter Drysdale, and through him, the East Asia Bureau of Economic Research and the South Asia Bureau of Economic Research, who have put the funding and the logistics behind this event. It was a big event to organise, and I see this event coming in that tradition of the ANU, of bringing together people to discuss difficult regional issues. So thank you to them. Thank you to Cleo Fleming and her team, who have put all the logistics together. And done a great job of it. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all our speakers today, especially those. speakers, especially those who have travelled a long way to come to this tiny city. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this event, for showing your support and your interest, and to all of you who have stayed through what has been a long day. I think that's testimony to the great presentations we've had, but also to your interests. We will finish with drinks outside. That is your reward for staying here. But we do have one more task to perform today. So if we could just again thank our panel and all the speakers. And I will now ask Dr. Martin Parkinson to come up and open the the Climate Economics and Policy Centre, which is part of the Crawford School, and which, with support of Tom, our director, and the Crawford School, will carry forward, we hope, this kind of initiative and dialogue. So, Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. I noticed that Stephen made sure that he closed the forum before I got up to speak. Otherwise, I would have made a few comments based on what I heard when I just walked in. But what I just heard of Matt Rogers' comments very much resonated with what I was saying this morning about, I think, the necessity of us to accept that we're in a bottoms-up world at the moment, even though a tops-down world maybe would lead us to a more economically efficient outcome more quickly. But look, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to launch the centre, and just in leading into that, and I think from what I've been told that's been covered today, it's very clear that your discussions have provided an insight into the breadth of the climate change action that's happening in our region. The policy challenges around climate change are complex and cross-cutting. They affect all sectors of our economy, from agriculture to energy. They impact all the way through our communities and our societies. To effectively tackle the problem, it's essential that we bring to bear the best and brightest minds, best and brightest policy responses. Second best isn't good enough, and third best, which is where we're heading in many ways, is really just not acceptable if you think about the alternative. So as Ian Chubb said this morning, we need to understand what makes a policy success, to take stock of the lessons that we've learned so far in real time. We need to carefully consider the options open to us, the benefits and costs of different policy responses, and the implications of using different policy instruments. In short, we need to apply our best minds, and to do so in an open debate around the challenges that we confront. Independent research is crucial to help inform stakeholders and governments about policy options, their policy implications, and to highlight the principles that should drive the policy decisions that we have to take. Today, I have pleasure in opening the centre. The centre will be, in my view, a strong voice in this debate, and I hope that the Centre for Climate Economics and Policy is seen domestically in Australia and internationally, particularly in our region, as a key source of ideas, of advice, and of question that will benefit all of the countries in our region and the globe more generally. The centre is part of the successful Crawford School here at the ANU, which is the, I emphasise the, not a, but is the leading institution for policy relevant academic research in Australia, in my mind. The centre will focus on the economics of climate change and its implication for public policy in Australia and more broadly amongst the countries of the Asia Pacific. It's going to cover mitigation as well as adaptation, both essential elements of a sustainable solution to the climate challenge. It will bring together leading researchers from ANU, from elsewhere in Australia and from overseas. And the fact that we've had such a distinguished group here today I think is just a mere glimpse into what we'll be able to do over time. It will be led, and this is not a paid advertisement, it will be led by the very capable Frank Iozzo. I am open to bribes, Frank. I could go further. And you've only got to look at the people who are part of the network that's being put together, not least of which is Steve Howes, who's been chairing today. But Frank, Stephen and all their colleagues have specialised in this area, and Frank and Stephen, through their work with Ross, have provided significant contributions to the policy debate in Australia already. And I know that Frank, through his leadership, will ensure that the Centre brings a strong independent voice to this issue going forward. I look forward to hearing the voice of the Centre loudly and frequently, both through published papers and the hosting of public events. I understand, I haven't looked at the website myself, but I understand that there are already papers on the website and that the team's well advanced in planning a conference next year on climate policy options for Australia. I've got a few ideas for you, Frank. I'd also encourage the Centre, though, to consider not only the scope for two-track dialogue or second-track dialogue of the sort we've had today, but also to think about the opportunities that one-and-a-half-track dialogue can offer. Peter Drysdale is sitting here in the audience. Many of you know Peter, but I'm not sure that all of you understand the contribution that Peter has made to policy development and economic integration in the region through the one-and-a-half and two-track dialogues that he has been closely involved in. And I think that, Frank, in all honesty, is a good model for the Centre to be thinking about trying to pursue. I think it's going to be really important to bridge the gap between the academic and the policy spheres, and this sort of approach is one way to do that. It's important that the work not only be policy relevant, but it be policy influential, and they are two different things. So, to open the Centre, I look forward to the Centre making a sustained, valuable contribution to consideration of climate change issues in Australia and with its partners throughout the region, and congratulate Tom and the Crawford School on this initiative. So, thank you very much.
Sincere thanks, Mr. Secretary, for your support, for your vision, and we will be listening to you at the appropriate moments, with independence, with a loud and frequent voice, as you're encouraging us to do. And I think right now it is high time for drinks, which are being served downstairs. Thank you very much.